Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. My name is Veera Campbell. I'm a partner here at Deloitte Helsinki. I'm in tax and legal, where I help our clients with their global workforce and reward-related issues. And today I'll be hosting our webinar on the EU pay transparency. Actually, this is part 3 of our short webinar series on the directive. About a month ago, we started talking about the foundations. So first, a little bit about job architecture, about jobs and cohorts and how they play a key role in pay transparency. Then a couple of weeks ago, we had a session on knowing the gap, bridging the gap. So how to do an equal pay analysis, talked about the metrics and remediation. And today we are looking at the reward ecosystem a little bit more detail. Here's our agenda for today. Before we get to today's topic, we thought we would start with an update on the legislation in Finland. This came after our previous session, so we thought it'd be interesting to do a quick recap of what the draft legislation looks like here in Finland. After that, we'll go straight into pay structures, variable pay, benefits, and talk a bit about the pay transparency at the end. As before, you can ask us questions using the chat function. We'll try and answer maybe some during the sessions, but of course, we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A and try and answer your questions then. We will keep it to the hour to make sure you get to your next meetings on time. But maybe we do quick introductions on the speakers. Maybe we start here in the room.
Hello everyone, I'm Sini Kausama. I was in the previous webinar and I'm a senior consultant at Deloitte Legal and I'm an employment law professional.
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Helene and I'm a manager here based in Helsinki, working mainly with international payroll, total rewards and payroll outsourcing matters.
Then we have Francis on the line.
Yes, hello, and nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Francis Pillebin. I'm a director of Total Rewards, really specialized in the broad spectrum of Total Rewards and doing a lot on pay equity and transparency today. So nice to be here.
But without further ado, let's start with the
Yes.
details.
So from the last webinar, there was published a draft legislation for the implementation of the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And the draft proposal was prepared by our Ministry of Social Affairs and Health Compartment. And in comparison to the previous governmental proposal, there are new additional details regarding the implementation work. First of all is that the reporting obligation is now going to be made through the incomes register, and the supervisory authority will be our equality ombudsman who will supervise the reporting obligation. And what is included to the reporting obligation, that it will include, first of all, the gender pay gap reporting, gender pay gap in terms of supplementary and variable components, median gender pay gap, median gender pay gap in terms of supplementary and variable components, and proportion of female and male employees receiving those supplementary and variable components. And in addition to that, there is also employer needs to inform, report through the incomes register the proportion of female and male employees in each quartile pay class. And the last information that the employer needs to report and also calculate is the gender pay gap among employees and by employee groups, which needs to be broken down by regular base pay and supplementary or variable components. So this needs to be calculated and reported by separate notification to the incomes register. So it is good information that the employer only needs to calculate this one last information. And what is also new information is that there will be a definition for supplementary and variable pay components, benefits, and the definition for the benefits under the proposal legislation will be that employee who receives directly or indirectly in cash or in other way, which has monetary value for the employee. So this is the definition for the benefit. And so benefits which are paid in cash or which have monetary value for the employee will be reported through the incomes register. And the supplementary or variable components could include, for example, bonuses, overtime pay, holiday pay, if the employee travels, travel benefits, and housing and meal benefits. And when the employer pays a training compensation, this will be also considered as supplementary or variable component. So this is very good update on the previous proposal, because now we have the definitions for the complementary and supplementary components. The second detail is that joint pay assessment will be conducted with employers when there is a 5% pay gap which cannot be justified or remedied within 6 months. So the deadline will be 6 months. And also what is new information is that the government proposal includes how the 6 months is calculated. The deadline would be calculated from the date by which the employer must have reported the information regarding the pay gap reporting obligation to the incomes register. So the 6 months period will be calculated from the end date when the employer needs to report the required information. And regarding the reporting thresholds, they are exactly the same what is laid down in the Pay Transparency Directive. So if you are an employer with 2,050 or more employees, the latest date when you have to report this information is by 7th June 2027. And if you employ 100 till 249 employees, you need to report in every third year. And for the employers with 2,050 to 2,049 needs to report by latest 7th June 2027. And it is interesting that the employers with 100 to 2,049 employees needs to report by latest to 2031. So these are the reporting thresholds. There probably will be some changes, I think so, regarding the reporting deadline for the 100 and 149 employees, because it's so late. But if it stays, then you need to report by the 2031. And also what is in line with the Pay Transparency Directive is the access to information. So the employer needs to provide without request to employees with a gender pay gap between employees broken by employee groups. And this will be submitted to the employer representatives and employees. And also the governmental proposal increases right to information. The employees have right to request information about their individual pay and the average pay of other employees who are performing same or equivalent work, which needs to be broken down by gender. This is in line also with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. And many probably ask, does this directive set any additional requirements for the employers? Our answer is no, but what needs to be taken into account is that also employers with at least 30 employees still needs to conduct the pay survey. So under the proposal, they have not proposed to take away the pay survey obligation. So still the employers who employs at least 30 employees needs to conduct a pay survey. And if you are an employer who employs at least 100 or more employees, you need to perform both pay survey and in addition the joint pay assessment when the joint pay assessment needs to be performed. And there is sometimes opposition regarding these pay surveys. And there are also other necessary updates that has been made to the previous proposal. There are key definitions which are included to the proposal, which are in line with the EU Pay Transparency Directive. They are the same definitions as laid down in the Pay Transparency Directive. And the employer also needs to give the necessary information required by the Pay Transparency Directive regarding the job applicants' right to information regarding the starting pay or its pay range. And what is also important to take into account is that if you have applicable collective bargaining agreement, you also need to give information regarding the relevant provision of the collective bargaining agreement. For example, if there are variable pay components that are included either in the pay salary, this needs to be informed in the job advertisement, before job interview or in another timely manner. But the latest time when the information needs to be given is before the employment contract is signed between the parties. And gender neutrality and job advertisements and job titles is also included in this proposal. And this same information was also in the previous governmental proposal. And new addition to the governmental proposal, which was not included in the previous one, was that there is now penalties for non-compliance. So there is so-called neglect fee, which needs to be paid if the employer does not conduct, for example, the joint pay assessment or employers' actions are against the Equality Act. And this neglect fee ranges from 5,000 euros and maximum amount will be 800 euros. Yes, there is. Yeah, correct. And also there would be a conditional fine which would be available to enforce the obligations proposed in the Equality Act. For example, if the employer does not give the necessary information through the incomes register, the authority of the incomes register can enforce a conditional fine. And there was not detail about what is the amount of the conditional fine. And there also will be a statute of limitation for claims, for instance, prohibition against pay discrimination, which will be 3 years.
So I think before we move on to the next one, I think there was some opposition to this in the media.
Yes.
It wasn't most popular. And so what should companies do? Should they kind of wait and see if there are any changes, or would it be better to proceed with?
That's an excellent question. Thank you, Veera. I think yes, companies should wait a little bit, because next there would be government would ask proposal objections from different authorities and also different organizations. For example, Confederation for Finnish Industries have opposed this proposal. For example, they have opposed that the employer needs to provide information for the job applicants, because they think that the information that currently is given to the employees is enough. But for example, regarding this information to give a pay range or starting pay, it is a minimum requirement required by the Pay Transparency Directive. So it is definitely going to stay. But of course, there can be some changes. Another thing that was opposed by the Confederacy for Finnish Employers was that they opposed that the employer needs to conduct both pay survey and joint pay assessment. So there probably will be some changes, and they proposed that the pay survey should be there should be same threshold as for employers who conduct joint pay assessment. So it will probably increase to 100. It would be in line with the directive as well. But it will be seen. We are
Interesting time.
interesting wait. Yes,
Yes.
definitely.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see how it actually goes through. Does it go through as implemented? And certainly it has sparked a lot of conversations here in Finland and in the media as well. And one interest point is, of course, how the implementation will actually happen and the reporting, and that's of course to see then. But yeah, thank you, Sini, for the updates.
Thank you.
Updates for the Finnish proposal. And next up, we're gonna give the floor to Francis to talk a little bit more about designing the reward ecosystem. But before we do that, we did have a small polling question for you to kick things off, just to see a little bit where we land on that. So this should be visible on your screens now. So the question is how satisfied you are with your current compensation structure. The compensation structure will be a very relevant and central part of the topics we will cover next. So interesting to see where the general consensus here lies.
Yeah, landing more on the neutral.
Yeah, quite a few
satisfied.
on neutral or satisfied. So that's a good starting point at least to go from. So no one is very dissatisfied. I guess that is always a positive starting point to go from.
Is that what you expected, Francis, on the response?
Yeah, I think it probably resonates with the fact that we have an audience that has some maturity in compensation structures. So that's good to see. And but of course, the neutral is also still some people and indicated neutral. So that does mean there is room for improvement. And certainly in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, yeah, this will be a crucial one to get that right, because it will become very sensitive, and we will dive into that I think now. So let's have a deeper look on how the EU Pay Transparency Directive will also influence your compensation structures. Okay, so I'm now going to talk you a bit through primarily two basic topics. So pay structures and pay progression structures, and then also variable pay systems. It's not the intention to have a theoretical discussion around pay structures and how they need to be shaped, but of course it's always good to have a sort of first theoretical overview to then also make it very tangible. How will now the EU Pay Transparency Directive change the way you're primarily applying your pay structures and bonus systems, but also communicating and governing. Because I think that the crucial part is around how will you communicate and how will you also make sure that your theoretical framework is applied in practice as it should be. So I think that is a crucial one. So if you look at pay structures, and again, assuming that there is quite some knowledge in the room or in this webinar on pay structures, we sometimes see a bit of a deviation. Of course, what you typically see is the textbook example is you need to start with your job architecture. And we talked about job architecture in our first session and the first webinar, but it's about attaching a work of equal value or added value to your jobs you have. So job architecture, that is ultimately where you need to start. That's your solid foundation, and that's the starting point. If you have the job architecture and you have done your job evaluation and classification, ultimately then you can have a look at your benchmark data, and then you can build, based on those benchmark data sets, also your remuneration strategy and structure. This is actually the classical example how this is being looked at. And quite often today, from a salary structure, pay structure perspective, focused on an external dimension, as being that benchmark element, that external benchmark element being one of the anchor points, not everything, but one of the anchor points of structuring your salary structures. Now, we will come back to that in a minute as well. That, of course, that dimension will change a bit, certainly towards talent acquisition and so on. If you need to recruit some individuals, you need to structure them in your pay structures, or need to slot them in your pay structures, and you need to come with a proposition. You will, of course, always look also at the benchmark, the midpoint of your salary structure, typically. But you will also need to balance that with internal equity, and that is quite a balance. Striking that balance again, and there are solutions for that. That needs to be shaped in line with your pay structures. But that is, for me, if you think about pay structures, how will that change from a design principle, is we will see that more and more companies, and we see that actually in practice, are carving in also the internal equity element when shaping their salary structures, and certainly when proposing a total rewards package and to their potential candidates they see. So again, this is just high level, the theoretical steps you need to follow, but the clear dimension of the EU Pay Transparency Directive is primarily shaping in also how can we contribute the internal pay equity in those pay structures. Now, if we quickly flip to the next slide, I think this is again building blocks for constructing a salary band. So what you see is that the grading system, which is again starting from your job architecture and leveling system, is now the horizontal axis. You have the vertical axis where the salary is being positioned. First of all, in the grading system, you will need to have a look how broad do you want to define that. That's what I call the grade width or the salary width, salary bandwidth. So what you actually see is, and it's not mentioned on the slide, but actually you see in practice there are two spectrums to that. You have a broad salary banding system or a narrow salary banding system. Of course, the broader you go, that is starting from your grading structure. It's not because you have a grading structure, for example, here from A, B, C, D, E, F, that you need to stick to that from a salary band perspective. You can also say, look, we will combine certain grades and make it a broader spectrum. Imagine B, grade B, for example, is maybe divided into B1 and B2. That could be perfectly, from a grading structure perspective, there could be more subtlety and nuance in that. But from a pay structure perspective, you're saying, yeah, we're taking those together, which we have seen in the last couple of years, in the last 10, 15 years, more and more companies are moving to, or have moved actually to, that grade pay structure. The other dimension is keeping it very narrow. That does mean the difference between broad and narrow is, of course, the broad leaves more discretionary power for managers or compensation or rewards professional to make decisions within that salary structure. If you go to more a narrow band structure, then it's a more rigid structure, which leaves more limited discretionary power for your management. And we always get, in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive, a bit the discussion or the questions from a lot of clients. Look, are we now moving from a broad-based salary structure to a narrow-based salary structure? And ultimately, the answer, it depends on how you structure yourself as an organization. If you have all your documentation and your governance and your processes in place to really explain why there are differences between broad-based salary bands, then you don't need to go to narrow-based salary bands. But, of course, if you don't have that all in place, narrow band salary systems do work more efficiently from a governance perspective, because they're more strict from a governance perspective, and you need to stick with more limited guidelines. So that is a bit the difference between broad and narrow graded, and that's an element that is crucial in shaping your salary structure. So a lot of companies are looking into, do we want to stick with the 70, 130, which is the broad salary, or do we want to limit it more to 80, 120, or within a salary band, also make sure you have certain pay zones. But we will come back to the pay zones in a bit as well. Of course, you have the salary range, the min, mid, max, the midpoint, as I mentioned, that is typically driven by external benchmark data sets. But again, there we see that quite often, certainly in talent acquisition, there's not only the midpoint that is being looked at, but it is also the internal equity. Because if everyone is below or above that midpoint, that does not mean that your average pay you report out on in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive has an impact. So that is quite crucial. And then the angle of inclination. You typically see that benchmark is not always exactly on a linear trend. And so that is structuring your salary bands in a way that it does also make sense from a progression perspective. Again, it depends on your job architecture framework. It depends on your career tracks. It depends on the progression possibilities you have in an organization. But typically, to have that progression, you need to have a sort of angle of inclination that does make sense. And you also see that at the right-hand side, the expectation of a theoretical salary band is more the linear trend. And this also makes sense from a career management, salary progression perspective, and to also shape that in the narrative towards your employees. The reality is often different, where you see that due to historical reasons, due to outliers, due to specific cases, it starts deviating. And that linear trend, that logical trend is not always 100% clear. And of course, that is becoming more and more clear now due to the EU Pay Transparency Directive, again, referring to the fact that people will be able to ask for average pay within the category of workers they belong, and category of workers that is considered as work of equal value. And what is per definition work of equal value is, as a baseline, your grading structure and your leveling system. Of course, you can further detail that out, but that does mean that you will need to come clean on how you detail that out, because it could be that that there are certain reasons why there is a deviation in, for example, category B, your grade structure or your salary structure B, because there are two job families in there or two job domains that have different market competitive data points or benchmark data points. But you will need to be able to explain that, because otherwise your labor unions or worker representatives and your employees will start asking questions. With who am I being compared? What is my worker category? So that is making that more and more sensitive. And certainly, and that's then the last point I want to mention on this slide, you see also at the highest grade, grade F, of course, you have some red circled, but also green circled individuals. It is something you will need to map. And typically also with a clear regression analysis, pay equity analysis can help you to really identify, is this now a real outlier, or are there good reasons, objective reasons why these people are, for example, below my salary structure? But I just want to mention, and that's a very important one, it will become more and more clear where they are positioned to their salary band. And even if they are within the salary bands, that does not mean that they cannot be perceived as I'm being paid at the lower end, because every employee will have full knowledge on the average pay of the category of workers today, to which they belong. Although it does make sense that they maybe are, for example, at the lower end of their salary band, if it's, for example, a comparatio of 70%, earning 30% less than the average, you can still argue whether a single employee will like that figure. So you need to have very good, valid reasons to be able to articulate that. And that is really a change management and not something that is that easy to manage within your organization. Okay, good. If we go to the next slide, so we talked about the salary banding structure. That's one. And of course, where you are then positioned in your salary band also has an impact typically on your salary progression. And I just want to emphasize that also in a pay transparency context. This is the merit matrix option. I'm going to focus on the merit matrix option. I know from a salary progression there are other systems in place, but that would lead us too far. I think most organizations are working with a merit matrix, but I'm happy to engage in questions or other perspectives if you want. But ultimately, if you look at your merit matrix, there are three main crucial elements you need to consider. And I'm not going to say this is the merit matrix for every employer here in this webinar. That depends on how you need to shape it and how it is shaped within your context. But typically, you have the employee performance playing a role, the employee position within the salary bands, and that's a crucial one. I will come back to that in a minute. And then the rate of increase that is being applied. And that is all factored in. So you actually apply a budget, and that's the left upper corner. The budget is being applied on those mechanisms. A budget that can be set on a country, on a business unit or department perspective. That depends on how budgets are being set. It could also be from a top-down approach, but also from a bottom-up approach. But that would go too much into the details to put that nuance in there. Now, what I just wanted to mention is that you can be very clear on this merit matrix, but you will need to be more transparent on how everything is positioned from those three dimensions. And just from an employee perspective, performance perspective, we often see that performance is being mentioned as one of the strategic pillars in your merit matrix. But in order to then in reality tie it to your merit matrix, we see that is something else. And not every company will be able to really tie that in full transparency towards your merit matrix. So ask yourself the question: what are we actually valuing from a performance perspective? Could be an annual performance, could be a sustained performance, could also be more competency and skills. But the question is then, is that linked to performance or something else? So that is first dimension I want to mention is employee performance. Also make sure that your performance, if you include that into your merit matrix, that your performance management system is tied in a good way, in a solid way, and also in a way that you can communicate this properly towards your employees. That's number one. And then what we often see, and that is a crucial one as well, is the positioning in the salary band is quite often also used as a determining factor to determine actually the merit percentage increase you are entitled to. And we quite often see that, and that's actually option one. And I'm always talking about option one, option two. There are also other dimensions and more hybrid forms. So it's just an example. But we see that sometimes it's primarily focused on the comparatio they have within their salary band. Now, of course, comparatio is just comparing where am I today from my salary perspective to the midpoint of my salary band. And ultimately, you could argue, is that actually a valid reason from a competency and skills perspective? Because the real question is, why am I so low in my salary band or so high in my salary band? And that is where a lot of companies are now looking at pay zones, not based on just comparatio, but actually based on job mastery level. Such as a junior, medium, senior, really independent of the exact pay, but more linked to the competency and skills, because that resonates better. If you are being transparent, if you need to be transparent on your salary progression system, you cannot just say, I'm at the bottom part of my pay zone of my salary band, and you therefore are more entitled to a higher percentage. You actually need to come up with valid reasons why is that, and that is that job mastery level that is typically being included into the pay zones. And then, of course, rate of increase, that depends a bit whether you want to give a predefined and consistent rate of increase. So companies that are saying, we want to get rid of managerial discretion. The only managerial discretion that there is ultimately determining the employee performance. And then everything that comes out of the employee, out of the performance management system is being determined automatically in our merit matrix, then you're taking away a bit that discretionary element. Or certain companies do say, no, we still want a range. So be flexible in the range we allow for differentiation, so that even within a performance system, that you still allow afterwards also some deviation based on managerial discretion. And that is, of course, more sensitive from an EU Pay Transparency Directive, because you will also need to document why there are reasons, why there is a difference in the range of percentage. And just to make that a bit more tangible, let us maybe jump to the next slide. Well, this is an example. I'm not saying again, this will need to be looked at specifically to the client context, company context, rewards framework, but also certainly the business and HR strategy that is being put into place. What I just wanted to mention is that here at the left-hand side, the employee position in the salary band is primarily based on the two components together. So indeed, the comparatio, so that is where are they today from a starter pay band, market pay band, upper pay band, but primarily making sure that the narrative is next to that. And that is what we often see lacking today in merits, in salary structure, progression structures and merit matrices, is the reasoning why people are in a developing a market pay band, or for example, a leader expert or upper pay band. And tying that to really also your competency and skill framework. And that will be crucial to have that in place, so that you can also put the narrative next to your logic you have applied. We quite too often see that it is just based on the comparatio instead of on the qualitative and competency skill set. Now, and if you then look in this example, employee performance was really the discretionary element of the manager. Is this best practice? That depends. It depends again on how well you can document, because if you still have the ability to pick between 0 and 10%, yeah, if you put someone on 0% or on 10%, you need to have good reasons. 10% difference is quite huge and massive if you look at it from a transparency perspective. So if you want to get rid of that manager discretion, yeah, then you also need to define clearly how can my performance management system be linked to my merit matrix, and how can this actually influence also the percentages. But here in this example, it has been left open. So there's still some managerial discretion to be provided. And again, it depends whether that works from a governance perspective and the documentation perspective. That is quite crucial to consider. Okay, good. If we then go to the next slides, I believe, yeah, this is so the EU Pay Transparency Directive considerations, and I think we have bundled them in 3 buckets, not going through all the points, but ultimately it's first of all the design that you need to have a look at. Employers shall have pay structures ensuring equal pay for equal work of equal value, sorry. So that does mean that you need to have a look at your design, as mentioned. Is everything factored in to allow that equal pay for work of equal value? And that is that's quite crucial to have that in place. So you will need to have a look at your pay level structure, your merit matrices, your pay progression systems, whether that is actually consistent with work of equal value concept. A second one is yeah, they will need to be in line with, if you then have work of equal value, so your salary structure, you also for pay progression need to make sure that these are received, pay and also benefits are received based on an objective and gender neutral criteria. So those criteria, again, primarily sits with the link to the performance management system. You will need to make sure that that is being consistent, but that is also being clear for managers. And I think that is something we quite often underestimate, but the change management for managers to fully grasp that it's not their day-to-day job. Rewards and HR professionals are in there, but you cannot be sufficiently looking into that and how to train those managers also from a performance review outcome perspective. And in ideal world, you typically also link that to a pay equity regression analysis to always sense check what managers have decided, and does that also make sense from a statistical perspective and from a regression analysis perspective? And are we not creating new gender pay gaps, or are we not creating new pay gaps as a whole? And then, of course, there's also something around communication. Communication towards employees, it's only mentioned employees, but I think also worker representatives. This is something totally new for some organizations. Some organizations are already more or less transparent, but for others, this is really still a bit of a black box, or partially a black box, partially already being communicated. So educating your employees, but also educating your worker representatives on how this all fits together. This is not something you will do in 1 month. This really needs to have a sort of paced agenda with some clear and solid structure behind that. So that is important to mention as well. Okay, good. Then if we look at, so that was about base pay and the base pay progression. Again, some first high level elements you need to consider from a EU Pay Transparency Directive. If you look at variable pay, yeah, we typically see annual bonus, long-term incentives, other incentives. Those are the ones we need to look at. Of course, I think annual bonus that is in principle quite clear under the EU Pay Transparency Directive. It will be the annual bonus that is paid out to that individual that you also will need to report out on. For example, long-term incentives, that is currently something that is not yet 100% clear. Is it a grant? Is it upon exercise? It depends a bit on the structure. Is it a stock option? Is it a restricted stock unit? You name it. That is, we can of course look a bit at what exists in the UK and in other jurisdictions where there is already gender pay gap reporting requirements. But anyhow, from an EU Pay Transparency Directive, this is also where we will need to see the evolution and how each country will deal with, for example, long-term incentives. That is not really 100% clear. We have some best practices out of different countries, but of course, we will need to see it country by country. And also other incentives, sales incentives, but certainly also recognition schemes. It's quite often forgotten that the recognition scheme also do have an impact on your gender pay gap. If you're very close to a certain threshold of 5% and you add certainly recognition and you see that the recognition for a certain reason for 75% goes more to the male population, it could actually just tip you over the 5% threshold. So also do not forget, and the smaller recognition schemes, they might also have an influence on your total package. So that is what I clearly wanted to mention as well. If you then go to the next slide, I think generally speaking, we have 3 big buckets of annual bonus structures. But again, this is very high level. We know there are much more hybrid forms, much more systems that are intertwined with each other. But ultimately, you have bonus schemes with predefined metrics in the beginning of the year, set very clearly without any actual deviation afterwards. So they have clear determined performance metrics and KPIs. And those are, of course, from an EU Pay Transparency Directive, the most solid ones because they are predefined and they are not looking really at any personal element. Then, of course, the second one is the full discretionary bonus, where there's no maximum opportunity set, and at the end of the year, together with the evaluation process, it is being determined what your bonus is. This is, of course, more sensitive, and you will need to have a look. Can this still work in an EU Pay Transparency Directive? Then, of course, you have the combination of 1 and 2, and that is what I meant. You have all sorts of form there. So again, for me, it's about making sure that principle of work of equal value with then that performance angle is clearly attached to each other. So robust processes to check for consistency. Now, if you look at how typically bonus plans are being structured, we can flip to the next slide. You actually should, and this is again a more theoretical slide on what are really the elements if you shape your bonus plan. What are the elements you typically need to look at? And of course, each of them also do have an impact from the EU Pay Transparency Directive, because you need to be more clear on ultimately what your pay processes are. So that also means becoming more transparent on your variable pay plans and variable pay systems. Again, both short-term as long-term incentives. So if you look at the plan type, is there more than one plan in your company? And typically there are bonus schemes in the company. The bonus schemes typically also differ from target population to target population. So will you be transparent on all your plans, or only stick to the transparency for one plan for the specific target population? And that is a question mark. Eligibility, who is eligible for certain plans? We also often see, for example, in long-term incentive schemes, that there is also exceptional eligibility due to specific circumstances, specific reasons, such as critical roles, retention, sign-on bonuses for high-profile individuals. But it's those eligibility criteria and those exceptional eligibility criteria that ultimately also will influence the results of your gender pay gap analysis, but also the average pay. Again, emphasizing that we're talking about transparency not only on base pay, but also on total cash and employee benefits. So long-term incentives, which typically takes quite a portion of salary package from a higher manager or executive level. Yeah, this is something you will probably need to look at. Is our eligibility criteria clear, crystal clear? Also, our performance measures. What are the behaviors we want to actually drive with our incentive plan? Are they also gender neutral? And how do we measure that? And that's the second, the performance measurement. Is that also crystal clear that the performance measurement is without bias and is crystal clear for everyone and cannot make any deviation between really the individual gender or any other demographic criteria? And then some other elements, without going too much into the details. I'm also looking at the timing, target opportunity, payout vehicle. But so it is crucial that each of those buckets you have a look at from an incentive plan perspective, long-term, short-term, or even other plans you might have, and have a look. Do they all resonate and align with what the EU Pay Transparency Directive is requesting for? Okay. Well, and this is then just a client example of a very, I must say, a rigid system, depending on where you put it. But you have your base salary, you have your time worked. So long-term absence can, again, from an objective perspective, still have an impact. The bonus target percentage is being determined across those specific target populations. And then you have your individual performance metric and a company performance metric. So depending on individual performance metric, that is, of course, the one where you need to be sensitive and be careful that is fully aligned with your EU Pay Transparency Directive. In principle, the company performance metric is something that is more general and collective, and so is less sensitive on the EU Pay Transparency perspective. Okay. Voilà. Yeah, I think we can skip this. Well, and again, a bit the same considerations from an EU Pay Transparency Directive. Is the design from your variable pay systems also considering work of equal value, equal work or work of equal value? Are the criteria you're determining, are these also objective and gender neutral criteria? And employers shall ensure that such criteria are accessible to employees. So again, that change management and communication, and I cannot stress it enough, that if you're currently not being transparent, that is really a one. If your design, of course, needs to be in order, and that's clear, but that change management and communication is a crucial one to consider. Okay. And that brings me actually to the next few slides. I forgot this one. This is about employee benefits. So again, the employee benefits, you also need to be well organized, and again, that work of equal value concept need to be in there. Now, that being said, we see that most companies are quite mature from an employee benefits perspective, that the eligibility criteria are less of a mess, if I can call it like that. And they are more nicely structured because, of course, people also see sometimes the benefit structures, so they can be more transparent. But also looking a bit at the timing, I just wanted to touch upon the last few slides. So if we can move forward to the pay transparency. Yeah, this is ultimately the pay transparency spectrum. And it's about balancing cost and resources to implement and operate pay transparency strategy. Because you need to be careful where you want to position yourself. I don't think forced transparency is probably not where you want to be. Because this is really being forced to be transparent, and sometimes could also have a negative effect, and it could also mean that you are in court or in legislative or in a certain case law. Now, reactive transparency, proactive transparency, that is about where are you today as a company. If you're not well organized, then you might want to be reactive You might want to await being very proactive, because if it's not well organized, not well structured, and your organization is also not ready, it has not yet gone through that change management communication, it's not easy to just change that on a short-term perspective. The proactive transparency, that is, of course, for very mature companies that are saying, look, we are actually on a good in a good shape from a transparency perspective. We're already doing a lot. And our design principles are also well organized. And I think it also showcases on the next slide. If I quickly flip to the next slide, yeah, you can immediately go to the next slide. Yeah, voila. This is what I wanted to show. If you look at your pay transparency roadmap, that is typically a sort of 4-step approach. I'm not going to say this is reality for every company, but this is a bit the best class example where you first need to look at your grade equity. Before you can even think about pay transparency, you probably want to first look at grade equity and grade transparency. So you first need to ensure that everyone is slotted in jobs with equal value and treated consistently across the organization. So you need to have actually your foundations, and that's what we discussed in the first session, in order. So really that robust job architecture leveling system. Once you have that, you can then actually work through grade transparency, making your grades more accessible, more understandable for employees. What is a grading structure in our organization? What are also competency and skills and career tracks linked to that? I think that is crucial. And it's only once you have done that you can also then have a look at your pay transparency. Of course, pay equity, that is an exercise that can already run in parallel. But of course, you will need to make sure that corrections are being made where it's relevant. If there are certain unadjusted pay gaps and you cannot explain it, and the regression analysis doesn't show you that what the difference is, then you might want to do those corrections first and make sure that those corrections are also being implemented before you can go to full pay transparency. Because again, every employee will be able to ask for average pay figures in their category of workers. And in order to go to pay transparency, typically we see that really requires that journey. And so really from grade equity, grade transparency up to the full pay transparency. And if you ask me a timeline, of course, in an ideal scenario, you can take 2-3 years. Certainly for large multinational organizations, this typically takes some time. We also see that certain companies are already somewhere in these buckets quite good organized. So then it's primarily, imagine you don't have anything, then it would probably take 2-3 years to get there. If certain pieces are already there of the puzzle, then you can probably accelerate that. And certainly, in view of the EU Pay Transparency Directive deadline, transparency will actually kick in as of June 2026. Not saying that is, of course, the full transparency like you see here at the right-hand side, but of course, it's already a quite advanced transparency, which is crucial to consider. Voila. I think this is, I believe, the closing slides. But happy to take any questions if there would be any. Thank you, Francis.
I actually wanted to ask a little bit of a follow-up to what you were just talking about. I mean, of course, we've been talking about a lot of new legislation coming, and some companies are a little bit waiting to see. But what are the risks and consequences of delaying the implementation of and putting the measures in place now?
Yeah, well, for me, it's what is as such clear, and that you see also in all legislations or draft legislation that is popping up is the transparency towards your incumbent employees. That has not changed in any proposition we have seen. So again, as mentioned in the last slide, to go to that transparency, that's quite a journey. You don't want to do that as an organization in a few months. You better start looking at that now, because if you are forced to do that, it has brand damage, reputational damage, and probably is not where you want to be. So be ahead of the curve and making sure that also your worker representatives and your employees are informed at the right time, because if it's all very reactive or even forced, that's probably not where you want to be as an organization.
There was also a question a little bit about the Finnish system, but also interested to hear if Francis has a view. So about the reporting through incomes register and the analysis done by a statistical institute. What are your thoughts on what kind of analysis the Institute is able to do with the information in this? So with the information given, what kind of analysis are they able to do with these important compensation structures?
Yeah.
Or do we expect that then there will be additional informations being requested?
Yeah, my view, and of course we will need to see the details, but my view on that is probably they will just do the metrics and the analysis from what we call unadjusted pay gap perspective. So just looking at the gender pay gaps, like we have seen quite some macroeconomic gender pay gap figures on a high level basis. They will probably also do that per industry on a national level. It will be more about the metrics, I believe, and of course, if companies are then above or below the 5%, also ask for explanations. I would be surprised that they go further, that they also go into a full regression analysis and go beyond that, because they will not have ultimately the details for that. And they will probably also not hold all the job architecture details and so on. So I would be surprised they go more advanced. But yeah, you never know. There are certain countries where, for example, governmental bodies, like in Switzerland, also come up with a regression model that is certified out of the government. So we will need to see what each country does. That is to be seen. But I think in this instance, it will primarily be focused on the metrics part and not really going into all of the details.
Yes, and I agree with Francis, and also the information that the employer needs to calculate will be imported via separate notice by the employer.
Mm-hmm. So maybe just to finish up very quickly, a question on bonus. Is this now, because of the directive, the kind of end of discretionary bonus structures, and do you kind of predict that there'll be more structured systems being put into place?
Yeah, and it's a typical challenge on bonus, but also on base salary structures. I don't believe this is the end of the discretionary bonus. I strongly believe that there is still place for performance-driven organizations for discretionary bonuses. The only thing is, and you could ask yourself the question, it's maybe a good thing, is of course you will need to be able to put the narrative next to that. Why is a bonus that much, or why is there a difference between two individuals or two groups of individuals, two groups as such of employees? You will need to be able to document and to explain differences. And of course, if you have a robust and a solid and actually a fair structure in place, it does also make sense to be more communicative and be more transparent around that, because we actually see that being more transparent also creates that trust with your employees.
Good. With that, I think we can move on to the next one. So this kind of concludes our mini series on the EU Pay Transparency Directive. Thank you very much for participating, and please do let us know if there are some questions you didn't get a chance to ask, or if you have any other requests or wishes for other topics we could cover in these webinars. So thank you very much to Francis and to all our other speakers, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.